I'd like to thank the State Library for giving me the chance to deliver the Don Grant Memorial Lecture. And in particular, I mean, it gets me out of teaching Nazi Germany today. Students love to learn about the Nazis. Anyway, in taking up today's theme of land and maps, I wish to share with you some of my research into the history of land in Victoria. One of my first pieces of research in my third year as an undergraduate was to examine a commission that looked into land settlement around Echuca. And basically there was a commission about the local squatter dumming, and there was a sort of report by a judge that looked into this report. And in this report, I only had the actual written report or printed report, but it led me to some sort of file numbers. And I don't know how I got to it, but I got those file numbers and it took me to the basement of this place, and I used those files in the Public Records Office. And I'm a very slow learner. I'm still using those files. But I soon found that although those land files are wonderful resources, I think we have to sort of use other records to tell us more about rural life. And in my own work, I've complemented land files with a range of sources. So I've looked at newspapers, rate books, the printed census. I don't think many family historians would look at that, but I think it's a wonderful source. I've also used statistical returns, and as a PhD scholar, I was very lucky to have complete access to the records of birth, deaths and marriage, which then were later, I think they were located down in sort of the bottom end of Melbourne. And again, I had use of those records when I was working with Alan Mayne on our book on families and community in the goldfields. And in recent years, I've tried to extend those sorts of genealogical records by also looking at the records that farmers have actually left us detailing their own personal lives. And I think it's one of the most interesting facts about rural settlers in Australia that they were a highly literate lot. Often the diaries that they kept are quite terse, and I'll show you one later on, but they are very revealing about rural life. And finally, I think another great source that you can look at is the records of the parish collection of agricultural statistics. Now, as family historians, you won't find anything in these about individual families, but you will find very detailed portraits of communities, and I suggest you have a look at those. Okay, so let me introduce my story today by looking at the experience of a family, the Herds, who settled in Victoria in the 1860s, living first at the goldfields near Castlemaine, and then in the 1870s, the Herds moved to a selection at a place called Gannawarra near Currie. Now, I think the case of the Herds highlights the range of documents that we can compile on thousands of families. Secondly, I think the story of the Herds points to the specific British and European origins of rural settlers. Third, the story illustrates the process of settlement was one conducted in stages, and one where I'm going to argue the family played a critical role. Finally, the Herds' experience shows us that settlement was a difficult process, dealing with new environments and new methods of farming. Although many failed in this enterprise and stories of distress were common, and I think you've got to be careful reading the lands files because you get these stories, and I might sort of give some reasons why you've got to be careful of them. But I think the picture of land settlement is, to quote from one of my former bosses, the late John McCarty, a story of progress, movement and achievement, where there was overall a progress towards material welfare in a democratic society and progress towards happiness. Now, let me illustrate this with the example of the Hurd family and then put the Hurd family in the context of overall settlement. Born in Waddingham in Lincolnshire in 1832, William Hurd was the son of an agricultural labourer. And his father was Thomas Hurd and his wife Mary. One of a large family of 7 children, and in a village composed largely of agricultural labourers, William Hewitt Hurd managed to acquire an apprenticeship as a butcher. At the date of the 1851 census, we can see his return to his original village, and he's now working as a butcher, and he heads up a family which includes his wife Hannah, then aged 29, and 3 children, Thomas, who I'll call Tom, William and John, and those 2 will figure in our story. Now, shortly after he leaves Lincolnshire and he comes to Victoria, I've not yet been able to find him on the shipping lists, but he sets up in the district of Castlemaine. And he arrives after the great days of the alluvial diggings, and it didn't turn out as well as he wished. And in 1877, this is what makes the story interesting, there's a series of letters written by William Hewitt and his son Tom back to Lincolnshire. And William writes, "I should have been obliged," that's spelt with a J, "to look for something else instead of the lumps of gold which I never got. I wanted to make a fortune quick, which a great many have done. Gold digging owes me about £1,000, which I never expect to receive." I'll just go on, you can... Giving up gold mining, William Hewitt and his family turned to land selection, and they selected land about 100 miles north of Castlemaine at Gannawarra. You can see here Thomas Hewitt, who was the eldest son, and he was the first to select, and he took up 320 acres in October 1876, and he's aged only 19. So he can take up land when he turns 18, a year after he's on the land. My next slide is a bit out of order, unfortunately. It just shows the British census from 1851 with the Hewitts as butchers. But when Tom selected in Gannawarra, he inflated his occupation and he called himself a farmer. But we know, you can see, I think you can see he's stated as a farmer there, but he was actually, we know from his letters, that he had been working as an agricultural labourer. And he explained to his family that his block was a mixture of open plain, and timbered land. And I think you can see the map here. And this is again looking at the fantastic maps in these files. You can see ordinary timbered with eucalypts. Now, the timber was useful because within 3 years, the settlers had to make substantial improvements to their property. In the first 3 years, they had to improve the property to the extent of £1 per acre. So in the case of Tom Hurd, he had to put in £320 worth of improvements, a huge sum. But what he could do is he could cut down those costs using the local timber. So within 3 years, he had constructed almost 5 kilometres, keep that figure in your mind, 5 kilometres of log fencing and half a kilometre of more substantial post and rail fences. And the local box timber was also used for a 2-room log house. Now, in a letter to his Lincolnshire uncle and aunt and cousins, Tom explained that bush timber cut down the cost of making improvements. Personal labour provided, I suppose, in a sort of later term, sweat equity, but work was almost unremitting in the early years of settlement. One of Hurd's fellow selectors, another one of my heroes, has left us a diary. He's a couple of blocks away from Tom Hurd. And his diary is very terse, but it's very revealing. And it gives us, I think, some feeling for the amount of work that had to be undertaken to, inverted commas, improve a Northern Plains selection. So let's just look at him for 3 weeks in June 1878. So we can see Monday the 24th, cutting logs. Tuesday the 25th, cutting logs. Wednesday the 26th, cutting logs. Thursday the 27th, cutting logs. I don't know if any of you ever cut box timber, but it's pretty tough. Friday the 28th, cutting logs. Saturday the 29th, went to Kerrang to football match. July the 1st, Monday, loading logs. Tuesday the 2nd, loading logs. Wednesday the 3rd, loading logs. Thursday the 4th, cutting logs for Chock and log. Friday the 5th, cutting chocks. Saturday the 6th, loading chocks. Monday the 8th, loading chocks. And this goes on for months and months. Now, just to give you an idea of what a Chock and log fence looks like, I've got a picture of one here, which was photographed in the early 1990s out near Muskerry, near Rushworth. And this is another one. My wife gets very sick of looking at these things, but I think unfortunately this one's been removed now. But you can see the logs going that way and the chocks going that way. You can see a chock there going that way. And these go pretty high because they had to be high enough to stop the stock getting out of. And I've got this one of my favourite Chock and log fences. Hey, you never think you'd come to a talk on fences, did you? Here's a Chock and log fence just at a place called Terricks. And it's such a wonderful fence. It's sort of made out of native pine and it stands there brilliantly. So as I said, that work of clearing, fencing went on for years. There was in addition the need to plough, seed and harvest land. And I think it's important to bear in mind that these selectors couldn't live a subsistence lifestyle. They had to generate income to pay for improvements, to pay for sort of equipment and also to pay their rents. So to get a selection, you basically had to pay rents of £1 per acre over a period of 10 years, by which, £2 shillings per acre over a period of 10 years, which comes out at £1 per acre. And in writing home to his family, Tom boasted to his family in Lincolnshire that in the first year he'd planted 10 acres of crops, and in the course of his 3-year licence, he had planted 30 acres ready for cultivation. Okay, now here's where families become important. Labour could be reduced by working in family groups. Tom explained in his letter that both his brothers were with him most of the time. And when his brother William selected the adjoining block of 300 acres, so you can see Tom Hurd here, and his brother is adjoining him here, and just over there is the third brother, and their father's there. I'll explain that in a sec. He explained that his brother William selected the adjoining block of 300 acres and they shared the cost and labour of their mutual fence. So one thing the selectors had to do was totally enclose these properties in a fence. And the reason for that was to put huge costs on the pastoral tenants, the squatters, so they couldn't afford to take the land. So we can see here that William and Tom share the labour of building that dividing fence. Now, I think it's also important to bear in mind that the Hurds had experience in working in southern Victoria, and I think they realised pretty quickly that you couldn't have the farms that you had in Lincolnshire. You had to have bigger estates in Victoria. And as you can see here, they have extended their farm and gone from the statutory limit of 320 acres to something like 900 acres, almost 1,000 acres. I think land selection files are wonderful resources, but the documentation on farmers' lives becomes thinner once the selector moves from being a licence holder to a leaseholder. So for the first 3 years, you're a leaseholder. And the reason for that, again, is, a licence holder for the first 3 years. And the reason for that is a licence gives you no right to that property. You can be removed at any time by the government. And again, that's a way of trying to defeat the squatters. At the end of 3 years, you get a lease, and that gives you more security of tenure. It gives you the right to transfer that lease, and it gives you the right to borrow on that lease. So we get I don't think I've got a copy of a lease, but I've got a copy from another area I'll show you later on. We get a great deal about farmers' activities in those first 3 years from their lease applications, but once they become a leaseholder, the documentation increases, and the file then just becomes correspondence about the payment of rents. So questions such as getting into debt is something that turns up on the files. Applying for mortgages has implications for paying your rent, and that comes on the file. And we get information about transfer of leases from those files. To go beyond the selection file, we need other sources, and I think the herd example shows us how we do this. We can track settlers beyond the date of obtaining freehold title. We've got to turn to other sources, and through rate records we can track land ownership of both individuals and communities over extended periods of time. And finally, I think we can learn much about communities from probate records. And again, when you start to use probate records, not just for the individual, but for the whole community, you can build up a picture of what people are doing with the land. And I said before, we have these wonderful parish statistics from 1906 to 1955. They tell us a tremendous amount about life in rural Victoria, a totally underused resource. Okay, the lands correspondence of the herds indicates that on a number of occasions they fell behind in the payment of rents. The lands officials threatened recalcitrant selectors with forfeiture of their estates if they didn't pay their rents, but I think it's important to note, and we'll come back to this later on, that these threats are often just idle threats. Now, I think one thing you've got to be careful when you're looking at these files, and one of my former colleagues, Marilyn Lake, in her story on soldier settlers, fell into this trap. What the selectors are going to do when they write to the Lands Office, they're going to present the worst story possible. And the herd family shows this brilliantly. I just remembered that in a moment. I'll come back to that. Okay, in most cases, farmers ask for their rents to be stood over, and they're allowed to. And forfeiture was very, very reluctantly used by the government. Okay, what do we know about the herds? By 1891, the Kerrang rate books show the herds still occupied their 3 selections. William Jr. farmed 300 acres, while his brother John occupied 290 acres, and he has transferred 30 acres to his father, William Hewitt, who works a sort of country store on that location. Now, Tom had said in 1870, and Tom occupies 2 blocks of 320 acres. Tom had said in a letter to his relatives in 1877 that he was not about, quote, getting an old woman yet. Yet it will do very well for a bachelor, talking about the country. And like many farmers, and again, looking at birth, deaths and marriage records, you can see that on average, farmers sort of probably marry 5 to 7 years later than, say, a miner in Bendigo or a labourer in Collingwood. Tom delayed his marriage until he was 38, when he married Rosanna Jane Hall, who was 22. Now, by not getting an old woman, that's what he says, yeah, Tom had used his time well, and in the period between the early 1890s and the late 1890s, he's gone on to acquire several more properties. And one of the interesting things, again, going back to my point about the lands files, in one of his files, he sort of states in, I think, 1899 that he simply can't afford to pay his rents. Things have gone bad, he's broke and he can't afford to pay his rents. But unfortunately, what happens in 1899, he dies and he leaves a probated estate of something like £5,500. And you can see from his probate inventory that that original selection of 320 acres has gone on to be about 1,400 acres. What the probate inventory can also tell us is that the way farmers farmed their properties. And in Tom's inventory, we can see that he was a pioneer of what was to become common in Australia, mixed wheat and sheep farming. And so on his 1,400 acres, he grazed almost 1,400 sheep, and he had, in the year that he died, he cropped 100 acres. Now, it seems to me that his heart wasn't so much in the cropping as in the rearing of sheep, because if you look at his inventory, he has very little in the way of agricultural machinery. And as I'm going to say later, this is becoming very, very important in the late 1890s. Okay, so Tom dies at a point where I think he's about to sort of he's already established himself as a very successful farmer, but he probably would have gone on and become much more wealthy. He leaves a widow and 3 young children, and unfortunately, Rosanna, his wife, dies in 1901, again aged only 29. Okay, just to sum up, I think that materially selection for most of the Herd family was successful. The exception was the youngest son, Jonathan P. Herd, who left Gannawarra to farm at Clayton in 1980, which was then, I suppose, on the rural fringe of Melbourne. That farm doesn't appear to have worked out, and towards the end of his life, he worked as a sort of common labourer in Melbourne. His father, John Hewitt, died in 1912, and he left an estate of just over £3,000. Most people in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, do not own any property. Only a small minority of people appear in probate records, about a third at the very most. So John Hewitt, the sort of father of his family, has done very well. And if we consider that he has come from a Lincolnshire agricultural village where most of his neighbours had been agricultural labourers, and in Lincolnshire agricultural villages, if you're an agricultural labourer, that's what you stay. His second brother also did very well. So William Jr. died in 1924, and by the time he died, he's left the farm, he's living off his investments, and he was probated at just over £6,000. So I think you can see in that story, 3 of the family do materially very well. And just to give you some idea of Tom's change in material status, you can see that he's gone from owning a 2-room slab hut to this rather substantial farmhouse by the end of the 19th century. Just as an aside, I rather admire Tom Herd. I'm not sure at this stage in my life I've forgiven one of his descendants. I'll leave you to guess who that is. Now, as practitioners in family history, the story I've outlined above is probably familiar to many of you and has resonances in your own family histories. For the remainder of my lecture, let me try and move from the family story of the Herds and put their story in the general context of 19th century migration to Victoria and in the history of land settlement and agriculture in Victoria. Now, this picture will draw on a number of studies I've undertaken. I've had the good luck to be sort of generously funded by the Australian Research Council, and my employers, La Trobe, have generously given me time to do this. I've also recently had some very good PhD students, and their work feeds into my picture. Okay, it has generally been accepted in the historical literature that the Land Selection Acts of 1860, 1862 and 1865 were a failure, and that pastoral tenants or squatters managed to acquire large land holdings. Now, I think this is true, particularly in the case of the Western District, and you can't come to a talk that I give without going away with looking at a few charts. You can see here in the Western District that the Western District has the majority, and this is a great source, this is from the census of 1891. The Western District has the majority of land properties over 10,000 acres. But you can see, I think, that farming has spread, small-scale farming has spread throughout Victoria. And I think it's very important too to note that farming is successful in the Central District, and it's also successful in the North Central District. I talk about these areas too because one of my students, Dmitry Ostapenko, I think has recently demonstrated that we talk about the failure of success of the early Land Acts. Dmitry suggests that many people, that the Land Acts were in places where it probably wasn't advisable for farmers to go. So there was nothing for farmers to do. There was no markets in this part of the world. But where farmers have markets around Melbourne and around the north central area, which is the goldfields, you can see that there are markets for their produce. And I think we can see this in another wonderful gem, treasure of the State Library of Victoria, the diary of Anne Catherine Currie. In the 1860s, Anne and her Scottish husband John selected a farm near Ballan, which is in the north central district. And if you read the first entries of the diary, which John buys the diary, and he keeps the diary for a number of years, but then there's a note in the diary saying, John got sick of his book and I'll take it over. And Catherine Currie then writes the diary for the next, I suppose, 30 to 40 years. And here we can see John, a Scottish settler, and Anne, who comes from a rural English county, and this is their baby Bert. He was a bit of a bugger that day. He kept crying all the time and wasn't very helpful when they took the photograph. But anyway, I think we can see from this diary that that family is doing very well in that sort of area, and I think this is a common practice. Farmers start out in the south, they start out in the north central district, and they move to other areas. So what they're doing as farmers is learning the rules of the game of farming in Australia and applying those rules to new areas. And so what we get is people moving from the Wimmera. If we go back to the former slide, we get people moving from the Western District to the Wimmera, and people moving from the north central area, central area, to the northern and northeastern plains. The Curries were silly enough, as I'll show you later, to move into Gippsland. Now, I've got some prejudices I shouldn't reveal publicly. I think J.M. Powell revealed over 40 years ago that the pattern of family selection was very important in establishing rural society in Australia. What the family would do, as I've said before, they'd move in family groups to acquire more land. They'd do it when their children reached the age of 18, and it's important to note that under the Selection Act of 1870, both males and single women over the age of 18 could select. So women play a very important part, I think, in rural Victoria. Okay, now, John McQuilton, in his History of the Kelly Gang and Selection in the Northeast, and Northeast is a part of Victoria I'm beginning to just like at the moment, It's incidentally a part of Victoria where my relatives, the Faheys, settled, taking up land in the sort of Toowoomba Valley. Now, in his work on the Kelly gang, John McQuilton argued that selectors in Victoria basically had very little agricultural experience, and this was one of the reasons they did so poorly as selectors in the area he was looking at. I don't think they did poorly in the area he was looking at, but that's another story. Now, I think John McQuilton provides very little evidence for this assertion, but I think if we sort of use the techniques of the family historian and look at the records of the family historian, birth, deaths and marriage records, we can see that McQuilton's observations are absolutely and utterly wrong. I've been lucky enough to assemble some databases from marriage, birth and death certificates, and with death certificates I've linked them to probate returns, and I'll say some more about that later on. And I suspect as family historians you've looked at these sources yourself. Okay, and I think these sources, when used in large databases, can tell us a lot about general trends. Okay, first, rural settlers frequently came from rural backgrounds in the UK and Europe. And of course, my herds show this, coming from Lincolnshire, which was one of those prime cereal counties of England. If we look at marriage certificates for 1871, it's pretty clear that something like 75% of those who list themselves as farmers come from farming backgrounds, and that's twice the proportion we'd expect if chance was the only, if it was only by chance they called themselves farmers. I suspect that many of these people who put their father's occupation down on their marriage certificate as farmers are probably inflating their father's social status a bit. I suspect that many of the so-called farmers were actually agricultural labourers, but nonetheless I think it shows that they do have rural experience. In the case of the Irish, putting yourself down as farmer, I'm not sure what that means. For the Fays in Galway, it probably meant you had a couple of acres and not much more, but it does, I think, imply experience with farming. Okay, the second point to note is that settlers frequently came from agricultural districts in their nations of birth. And I'm saying by definition, almost all Irish migrants came from rural regions, the possible exception being the minority who came from Dublin. However, when we look at the case of English and the Scottish, rural backgrounds also stand out. Okay. My estimates for farmers dying in northern Victoria in the late 19th century is that about 40% of English farmers came from English rural counties. Now, a lot of people not coming from Lancashire, Yorkshire, which I haven't sort of designated as agricultural counties, also have a rural background. And about another third come from Cornwall. Now, Cornwall has a high mining background, a high sort of preponderance of people in mining, but I think it's also important to note that many Cornish miners worked in agriculture as well. When we look at the Scots, again, I think we see this experience in sort of farming at home. In the case of the Scots, over a third came from agricultural counties, and when we drill deeper down into those who come from industrial counties, places like around Glasgow, we find that many of them, John Currie being a good example, are people who have moved to the industrial areas, Glasgow and the like, from rural backgrounds. So in a sense, what I think they're trying to do is they have been forced by improving agriculture to move to industrialism, but they see Australia as a way of continuing that agricultural lifestyle. And as I say, my friend John Currie is the best example of that. Okay, when we look at the Irish, the counties of Clare and Tipperary are the most common areas. About 40% of all Irish migrants come from Clare and Tipperary. And again, I think this is important. When we look at sort of the Faheys, you know, sort of, how would you describe the Faheys? Lacking in all sorts of characteristics, sorry. The Faheys come from County Galway, and only a small proportion of the Irish come from the county of Connaught, which is the county most severely impacted by the famine. Most Australian Irish are coming from this, I suppose, corridor going from the west through Clare, Tipperary, through Leinster to the edge of Dublin. And I think what's important when we understand the backgrounds of migrants, what's happening is I don't think we're getting Irish fleeing the famine coming to Australia, but we're getting the next wave coming from improving farms in this area. And I would argue what they're bringing to Australia is a commercial mindedness, which I'm going to show comes up very clearly in their farming practices. And I think it's also important to note for all you sort of dyed-in-the-wool Southern Catholics in the audience that about 1 in 4 of the Australian Irish come from the north. Some of those are Catholic, but when we sort of look at other sort of indicators, I think about one quarter of the Irish farmers are Protestants, Presbyterians and Methodists. Okay, and I think it's important, having said this, that we've got to get rid of that old chestnut that the Irish were excluded from land in Australia. We've got to sort of rid our heads of notions that Ned Kelly was in any way typical of the Irish. Ned Kelly is just a bloody thug where his neighbours are trying to establish themselves as good, honest, landed farmers in Australia. And what we find is that if we look, I've taken a sample of marriage certificates from 1881 from the north of Victoria, we can see that this is the proportion of the Irish as amongst all fathers. We can see that they are overrepresented amongst farmers. Sorry, I'll go back. And we can see that the English are underrepresented, the Scots are just slightly overrepresented. So there is this, sorry, the Scots are down there, aren't they? Sorry, this has lost its, this is the Irish, the Scottish, the English, the Germans and the Australians. And you can see by 1881 that Australians are moving into land settlement. Again, that's the case of their fathers using the Land Acts to get their sons on the land. And I think it's also important to note that when we look at the Irish, Irish women are overrepresented as wives of farmers. Sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. So Irish women, I suspect, are getting some social mobility in Victoria. Finally, on this sort of social or national origins of settlers, I'll just go forward. This is what I've done recently with marriage certificates in 1871. It's a sample of all Victorian marriage certificates, and you can see that the Irish are very much overrepresented amongst those who on their marriage certificate describe themselves as farmers. The English are underrepresented as farming, and so are the Scottish. Okay, I think we've got to ask the question, what remains, what was the outcome of the Land Acts? And again, I want to confront some persistent myths. I think too often historians, particularly some of my feminist historians, friends, use the stories of Henry Lawson and Barbara Baton to give us an image of the poor, struggling selector. Again, I think this is a theme that comes out in John McQuilton's work on Kelly Country. He talks about a culture of poverty in the northeast. Popular historians such as Rob Lynn and Robert Brunby are also pessimistic about rural settlement. And if you really want a lurid account of rural settlements go no further than the great Charles Manning Clark. And Manning Clark writes, and I'll quote, "By 1880, it looked as though the ancient uncouth continent would destroy all human endeavours to create a class of small property owners between the big men and their employees. Once again, as in the convict period, the bush had barbarised its would-be robbers and destroyers." As we can see from the diary of William Craig, the selection process was one that required enormous labour to clear, fence and bring land under the plough. The task of clearing, I think, varied from area to area. In the grasslands of the Wimmera, a farmer could get maybe 50 to 100 acres cultivated in the first 3 years. In the Northern Plains, it was probably lucky to get 50. In Gippsland, you're just going to spend your whole lifetime trying to clear a property. This is my next slide is an unfortunate slide because it shows an area of the Northern Plains being cleared in the early 20th century. This block survived the Selection Acts because it had been bought by a pastoralist in 1861. But you can see here in the northern districts, what we've got is open bushlands. And you can imagine that in this case, what they've done is they've ring-barked the trees and they stand there for years afterwards. To give you some idea of what the Northern Plains looked like, this is a wonderful piece of land just north of Bendigo, which has never been cleared. It was an old school reserve, and you can see the nature of that open forest in Northern Plains. And these open forests would be interspersed with plains country with grass. And then as we move to Gippsland, you can see you're really up against it. Here we can see, these remnants of these once magnificent forests. And as I said, it takes a lifetime to clear these blocks. And if we look at John Currie's selection lease, we can see that he literally does, in his fencing, he literally does miles and miles of post and chock and log fencing, and he has to clear 200 acres. In all, the Currie family took up 400 acres, and when you come to look at John Currie's probate inventory, they've only actually cleared about 200 acres of that. And I can't resist showing you these slides. You can see some of the things they did with that sort of timber. These are some pictures of barns in the Donald district. Beautiful construction if you look at it too. The sort of wonderful way they've created this barn with she oak timber. Okay, selectors quickly learned about the variability of this Victorian climate, and just to give you an example of this, when the Land Act was introduced, the land officer at Echuca wrote, "With the Land Act of 1869, a great improvement in the seasons took place. The rainfall increased, the grass became abundant, steady and increasing settlement took place, which has now amounted to a rush. And the cry is, they still come." And they did still come, but the rain didn't come. And between 1877 and 1881, there were a series, I suppose it's an El Nino year, there's a series of dry years. Selectors could also be hit by crop diseases, and I've got one of my favourite friends here, John Sweeney, who settled in a little place called Balcomore. He writes in 1878, "Before my crop got the rust, it looked as fine a crop as there was in the district. But through the rust and the hot winds, it very more than paid its own expenses. And now I expected to be able to pay 1/2 year's rent, and if I can pay it in a month, in October, the remainder I will pay once after the harvest." Again, it's an example of a selector asking for a revision of his rents, and he gets it. Another problem that John Sweeney also faced in Balcomore, in his first crop, he had to take a 45-mile drive to the nearest station. By the time of his second crop, the railway had been extended to Shepparton, and the trip took only 2 days. only 2 days carting 4 bushel bags of wheat on drays. It's a labour demanding exercise. It's an expensive exercise. Eventually, within 3 years, the railway came progressively closer, and John Sweeney is eventually able to sort of say that, aha, it's only 2.5 miles from my property. Okay, now there is no doubt that the rigours of settlement took their toll on families, and you can see from some work I've been doing on the Wimmera that in the early years of settlement there is a massive drop in the number of farmers. So you can see here that in the shires of Wimmera and Dunmunkle, which are near Horsham, something like 2,000 settlers drops to about 1,000 by 1891. So in 1876, they're in the process of getting those places from licences to leases, and the rigours of settlement make the numbers drop by about a half. In the case of where John Sweeney settled, I think about half the settlers disappeared. But what I'm going to argue happens is that after a period of time, if we look at the Wimmera, we can see that the number of properties stabilises and in fact increases over the period from 1891 to 1921. One of the reasons for this increase in the number of properties is simply that mallee land is released in these suburbs, shires, and there's more land available. Okay, now, I want to finish by sort of saying that in the north, I think that over the course of the 19th and into the early 20th century, settlers developed a viable system of farming in Victoria. In the first 2 decades of settlement, settlers undoubtedly overcropped, and crop yields declined dramatically. So if you were to look at a chart of cropping in the same shire, you'd see that it plummets like that between 1870 and 1891. And there is some suggestion that by 1891, farming in Victoria was in crisis. But what happens, I think, in the 1890s is there's a number of developments which makes farming possible. First of all, farmers try to increase the size of their properties so they can compensate for declining wheat yields by a bit of money from sheep, and we can see sheep coming into this very area in 1891. But what's also happening is the science, if I can use that term, it's probably not appropriate, but the science of dry farming has reached Australia, and people are beginning to use fallowing, ploughing their fields in winter as a way of saving moisture, and sheep become part of that fallowing system. What also happens, and I think this is the main factor that drives change, is that as well as fallowing and the introduction of sheep, we get the introduction of superphosphate in the 1890s. It starts out in South Australia, where so many sort of changes start out, and it hits the Victorian farming districts in the early 20th century. And superphosphate is able to be used because they introduce a new machine, the seed drill, which allows it to put it in. What we also get in the early 20th century is the introduction of a variety of wheat known as Federation, which we all learnt about when I was at school. I don't think people learn about it nowadays. And we also get reduction in harvesting costs. So you can see here, in my next slide, you can see here, very quickly farmers introduce these new means of harvesting. This is a stripping machine which strips the heads of the grain off. They then have to be winnowed, and this is replacing, the English style of using scythes and sickles. In the early 20th century, H.V. Mackay, ripping off various other inventors, comes out with a sunshine harvester and later the stripper thresher. So these things are reducing labour costs. And superphosphate is also increasing the productivity of soils. So what we get in the early 20th century, I think, is my next slide. Again, I'll give you a chart. You can see this is a farm in Horsham. You can see that this family's productivity of wheat, a moving average, we can see this dramatic increase in productivity in the early 20th century. And I would argue that the earlier 20th century becomes a period of great prosperity for Australian farmers. Farmers are the majority of people leaving estates of over £1,000, and we get in the probate records of 1911 a new term, retired farmers. And I'm just going to go on and just show you that, we'll just look at this one. You can see this is the proportion of farmers leaving estates of over £1,000, or leaving us, it's the median wealth of farmers in 1897 to 99. And again, you can see that Ned Kelly is not the most prominent Irish farmer. We can see that the median estate of Irish farmers is £1,000. Germans, I wouldn't pay much attention, it's a very small number, but you can see that English £100, Scots much the same as the English. So what we're seeing, I think, is a group of very widespread property owners in Victoria having, in terms of the rest of the society, owning more property than most urban people. I think one of the interesting things is living standards in the country are probably higher than they were in 1911 than they are in the city. But this all changes, and I haven't got time to go into it today, but I think the prosperity of the early part of the 20th century led to two further waves of settlement before the war. First, in the 1890s, settlers moved into the Mallee, and in the southern Mallee, we have the development of new technology for cheaply clearing blocks. And those Mallee farmers in the southern Mallee practice the new technology that their sort of fathers and they'd used as sons in the Wimmera and the Northern Plains. So that I would argue that's successful before the war. But what I think happens in the early 20th century is there is a reaction against this style of farming, against the use of native pasture for sheep. And we go back to this constant dream in Australia, right up, I suppose, until the end of the Second World War, that we've got to have small farms. We've got to have a yeoman class on farms. And in the early 20th century, the government takes over, purchases back from the pastoral tenants large estates and sells those estates to what are known as closer settlers. And those closer settlers are put on irrigation blocks, they're put on dry land blocks, but they are always put on blocks that are too small to be viable for Australian farming. And this leads to a dramatic crisis in Australian agriculture in the late 1920s, when commodity prices drop. These closer settlers are in all sorts of dire financial peril, and they are not. The only way the situation can be saved is by the government and the city taxpayer bailing them out, writing off their debts, giving them larger blocks. And just as a final point, I think was this morning's session, the sort of system of soldier settlement was talked about. I mean, soldier settlement is just a subset of closer settlement, except the government allows the soldier settlers to get deeper into debt. And soldier settlement, in terms of the Mallee, also pushes into the northern Mallee, where the properties aren't as prosperous as in the southern Mallee. I can't say anything more about that, but I think it is an example of huge government stupidity, and it's a story I'll leave for another day. Thank you.